My husband had to work out of town. The usually bustling house suddenly felt so quiet. At first, I thought I could get through it all on my own. But there was one moment, one small incident that made me realize I wasn't as strong as I thought. In that situation, I made a simple decision to ask my son-in-law for help. I thought it was just a simple need, a normal family thing, no one-ish. But it turned out that from that decision, everything changed. Relationships, trust, even my perspective on family were all tested. So Boogie, if you've ever felt like you were at a point where one small decision could change everything, then my story might feel very close to your heart. I'm living a life that for many might seem ordinary. Every morning, I wake up early, open the windows, and let the sunlight slowly stream into the house. The cool morning air is always my constant companion. It fills the semi-darkness that sometimes comes uninvited. This house isn't big, but it's full of memories. Every corner holds stories of laughter, of struggle, and of, that is the reason I've this long. My husband is a good man, a hard worker who rarely complains. However, his work often takes him out of town, leaving me alone at home for long periods. At first, I never minded it. I was used to it. In fact, I felt strong, as if I didn't need anyone to fill my days. ETs. I spent my time cleaning the house, cooking, and occasionally watching television. My life went on at a calm pace, too calm perhaps. My son was married and now had his own life. I was proud to see him happy. My son-in-law was also a kind, polite person, not much of a talker, but always showed respect whenever we met. He often helped me when I needed something, even though I rarely actually asked for it. That afternoon, as usual, I sat on the porch enjoying a cup of warm tea. The wind blew softly, carrying the sounds of children playing in the distance. I smiled a little, savoring the simple moments that are often the most meaningful. But behind the calm, something was slowly starting to change. The days seemed longer, the nights were quieter, and this house, which had once felt warm, was starting to feel too empty. I tried to distract myself with activities, cleaning out the closets, tidying the kitchen, even rearranging some of the furniture to create a different atmosphere. But there was still an empty space that couldn't be filled with activity alone. One night, I sat alone in the living room. The television was on, but my mind wasn't really there. I just stared at the screen, distracted, as the sounds outside grew quieter. I glanced toward the bedroom. Usually, at this hour, my husband and I would have a light conversation before bed. Small things that might not be important, but enough to fill my heart. Now, everything felt different. I took a deep breath. Maybe it was just a momentary feeling, I thought.
Maybe I just wasn't used to the quieter atmosphere of the house, But deep down, I knew something was beginning to change within me. It wasn't just about loneliness, but about the need to not feel alone. And without realizing it, that feeling slowly pushed me to a simple decision. The decision to ask for help from someone I had always considered just another member of the family, my own son-in-law. And at the time, I didn't know that small decision would bring about a profound change in my life. The night came earlier than usual. The sky was dark, the wind was blowing a bit strong, and the house felt increasingly quiet. I tried to calm myself with my usual routine, preparing a simple dinner, tidying up the kitchen, and then sitting in the living room as usual. But for some reason, there was a feeling of unease that was hard to explain.
As I was sitting, the lights in the house suddenly flickered and then went out. It was dark. It was silent. My heart started beating faster. "Oh God," I whispered softly. I stood up slowly, trying to find a flashlight in the drawer. But in the darkness, every step felt heavier. The house that used to be familiar now felt foreign, even a little scary. I tried to turn the power back on from the panel, but it didn't work. Panic began to set in. There was no one there. No sound. Just me and the house that suddenly felt too quiet. In that moment, without thinking, I reached for my phone. The name immediately came to mind. My daughter-in-law. My hand hesitated for a moment. Was this necessary? Or could I handle it myself? But fear was stronger than doubt. Finally, I pressed the call button for a few seconds. That felt like a long time until she finally answered, "Yes, ma'am." Her calm voice made me a little relieved. The lights in the house were off. Mom didn't know what to do. She stiffened slowly, trying to sound calm, even though she wasn't. "Calm down, ma'am. I'm coming now." It was a simple answer, but enough to make me feel less alone. About 20 minutes later, the sound of a motorbike stopped in front of the house. I immediately opened the door. He came in, slightly out of breath, but immediately smiled politely. "It's okay, Mom. Let's check first." I nodded, letting him in. In the light of the flashlight, he carefully examined the electrical panel, the cables, and several parts of the house. I just stood behind him watching, feeling a little relieved that someone was there. Not long after, the lights came back on. Light filled the room. And strangely, not only the house felt brighter, but also the atmosphere inside me. "It's okay, Mom. Just a small problem," he said with a smile. I nodded. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I might have panicked myself." He just smiled slightly. "It's okay, Mom. It's my job." It was a simple sentence, but somehow it felt different that night. We sat for a while in the living room, making small talk. Nothing strange, nothing excessive, decaf. Just the usual conversation between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law here. But in my heart, something changed. Evia. The calm that had appeared earlier slowly gave way to a feeling that was hard to explain. It wasn't something wrong, but it wasn't something I could just ignore. After a while, he excused himself and went home. The house was quiet again. But this time, the loneliness felt different. I sat alone, adjusting the door that had just closed. And without realizing it, I began to think about something. What if I needed help again? And more than that, why did his presence tonight feel so special? I took a deep breath. Maybe it was just a fleeting feeling, I thought. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about the power outage. This was the beginning of something that would slowly test me in ways I never imagined. From that night on, I began to feel a change in myself. At first it was small, almost imperceptible. But over time, the feeling grew. A sense of comfort whenever there was someone I could rely on in a house that was usually quiet. I began to contact my son-in-law more often. At first, it was purely out of necessity, sometimes for small things. Fixing a faucet, checking a door that was difficult to lock, or just to make sure everything was okay. He always came without asking many questions, always polite, and never made me feel uncomfortable. But that was precisely what made me depend on him even more. The house that had once felt empty now felt different every time he came. There was a sound, there was activity, there was a presence that made me feel less alone. And without realizing it, I started waiting waiting for a reason to contact him again, waiting for the sound of his motorbike in front of the house, waiting for a presence I shouldn't have waited for. I tried to ignore the feeling. Over and over I told myself, no, it's just a matter of habit, just feeling less alone. Nothing more. But the heart can't always be controlled by logic. One afternoon I was sitting on the porch as usual, but this time my mind was restless. I stared at the empty street in front of the house, as if hoping something would happen. And that's when I began to realize I'd gone too far. I started to limit myself, reducing the reasons to contact him, trying to return to my old routine, but that's where everything felt even harder. The loneliness I used to be able to endure now felt deeper. It was as if I'd gotten used to someone's presence and then been forced back to being alone. But the problems didn't stop there. The surroundings began to change. Some of the neighbors began to pay more attention to me than usual. Their gazes were different. No longer casual, but full of questioning. One day while I was buying groceries at a shop near my house, I heard a soft whisper behind me. It was Mrs. Attic, the one her daughter-in-law often visited. I froze. I didn't turn around, but those words were enough to make my chest feel tight. I walked home quickly. My thoughts were in turmoil. All this time I had felt that everything was still within reasonable limits. But apparently, not everyone saw it that way. And what was more painful, maybe I myself was starting to lose those limits. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The lights were bright, but my heart felt dark. I held my phone, staring at my daughter-in-law's name saved there. My fingers almost pressed the call button. But I stopped. This had to stop, I thought. I couldn't let things get any more complicated. However, just as I was trying to convince myself, my phone vibrated. The name appeared first. My daughter-in-law. My heart immediately started beating fast. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, hesitant, afraid, but also wanting to answer. And in that moment, I realized that even the smallest decision I was about to make now could lead everything in a direction I could no longer fix. My hands were shaking as I finally accepted the call. "Hello, Mom." Her voice sounded hesitant from the other end. I took a slow breath, trying to calm myself. "Yes. What's wrong?" A few seconds of silence. "I just wanted to ask, is Mom okay? She hasn't contacted me in days." She said, "Be careful." My chest feels tight. That simple question just brought everything I've been holding back to the surface. "I'm fine," I replied, briefly. "But I know my voice isn't convincing." "You sound different," she continued. "If anything happens, just tell me. I'm still ready to help." That sentence just makes it harder to keep my distance. I closed my eyes for a moment. "I felt like we should talk," I said quietly. That night she came to my house again. But the atmosphere wasn't like before. There was no casualness, no small talk. There was only tension hanging between us. We sat facing each other in the living room. I lowered my head while she stared at me, waiting for me to speak. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "Maybe I've been asking for help too often." She immediately shook her head. "It's okay, Mom. That's normal." I lifted my head. "No," I answered firmly. "It's not that simple." She fell silent. I took a deep breath. People started talking. I continued. And I also began to feel that something was wrong. His face changed. He was starting to understand where this conversation was headed. "We have to keep our distance," I said quietly, but clearly. The atmosphere immediately fell silent. He looked down and then nodded slowly. "I understand," he replied. That answer should have made me relieved. but somehow it felt painful, like the loss of something that had been silently filling the void. Vara subescotet. But it didn't end there. Suddenly, my phone rang. My husband's name appeared on the screen. My heart immediately beat faster. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then picked it up. Yes, my voice is a little shaky. "I'll be home tomorrow," he said briefly. I fell silent, faster than a horse. "Yes," I answered quietly. The call ended. I lowered the phone slowly. The atmosphere changed. Everything felt more real now. My husband was coming home, and everything that had happened so far was mine to face. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She also seemed to understand the situation. "Tomorrow," I said quietly. "Everything must go back to the way it was." She nodded. "But ma'am," she hesitated for a moment. "If you knew, that question would make my chest feel even heavier." I stared blankly ahead. I knew. This was the point where I had to make the most difficult decision, tell everything, and face the consequences. Or keep it all in and live with the guilt. I closed my eyes slowly, and deep in my heart, I knew there would be no easy path after this. The night felt long. I sat alone after my daughter-in-law returned, staring at the living room, which had returned to silence. But this time, the silence felt different. Heavier, more filled with thoughts I could no longer escape. I knew I couldn't escape. If I kept hiding everything, perhaps no one would ever know. But I myself would never truly be at peace. And for the first time, I asked myself, what kind of life do I want to live after this? With a heavy heart, I finally made a decision. I would be honest. The next day, my husband came home. As usual, he entered with a tired smile after a long journey. The house, which had been quiet until now, felt alive again. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at me warmly. I nodded slowly. "Okay." But this time I couldn't pretend everything was okay. After he rested for a while, I invited him to sit in the living room. There was a different silence. I took a deep breath. "I have something to tell you," I said quietly. He looked at me, a little surprised. "What's wrong?" My hands felt cold. I began to tell him about my loneliness, about my decision to ask for help, about how things were slowly becoming complicated. I didn't hide anything. Every word felt heavy, but also a relief. My husband was silent for a long time after I finished. He didn't get angry, didn't speak right away, and that was what made me even more afraid. A few seconds that felt like an eternity. Finally, he took a deep breath. "Do you feel that alone?" he asked softly. My tears immediately fell. I nodded. "I was wrong," I whispered. He stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "We were both wrong," he said. I was shocked. "I left too often and thought you would always be strong," he continued. Those words made my chest feel relieved and full of emotion. There was no great anger, no screaming. There was only honesty and a desire to improve. A few days later, I also spoke with my son-in-law. We agreed to keep our distance, maintain boundaries, and make sure everything was back in place. Slowly things started to get better. Not easily, not immediately perfect, but calmer, more honest. And most importantly, there was no more hidden burden